思い出す。後悔の定着は魂がほんと素敵なの。人なんてはまらない。身を背負えそれはない。変わっていた僕は受けずを追いかけるまま。どこまで大丈夫よしだって。ねえ僕を叱ってよ。正直者が夢みたいならせめて僕を騒いでよ。最後まで甘えてしまうのは俺だって死ぬんだよ。空白だって死ぬんだよね。足りないものを望んだら僕じゃない僕に出会ったよ。それでも前に進んだの。ふらふらしちゃうようにも足りない僕を愛してよ。でもママが僕を育てたの。君には僕が見えるかな。孤独な家のだ。ねえ僕と分かってももう抱きしめなくていいんだよ。へいねえ僕が分かったらもう一度笑ってくれるかな。ねえ僕を叱ってよ。正直者が夢みたいならせめて僕を騒いでよ。最後まで甘えてしまうのはねえ僕を甘いでよ。もう地球あるこの世界からせめて僕と踊ってよ。最初からいないと分かってた。幻だって死ぬんだよ。嘘つきだって死ぬんだよ。どうだっていいことを嘘って吐いて戻れない。思考なんてやってこない。奪ったように奪われて脳内真っ赤に濡らして徘徊。感情へ気づくやしで毎回継続本心隠してこっちに来ないで来ないで。いっぱいな友情論外将来論感がまでにこって生産狂気の震える世間にバイバイバイバイしたい。タッタッタッタ色い真っ赤に漏らして原本がどうかそうみたいに将来間違ってんのは世界の方でわかるでしょわかるでしょ。AI変えない救済通常生存していない無意味な虐待。実際狂気も食わないこの世がバイバイバイバイしたい。けなし合って妬み合って嫌い合ってさ。不正解だった引き出し合って長い少し見てもああでも振り向かないやないない正常だって一人になってもたくさんはずっと一人だったね。前も見えない愛のはいバイマットに探して周回絶賛頭の短い開廃断現状証拠なんてこっちを見ないで見ないで。AIがいない友情だんだん公開格闘類無味根本実質食器の立ち抜く矛盾にバイバイバイバイしたい。食らい合って恨み合っていがみ合ってさ。未来が奪った引き換えちゃって人生いつかってみてもああ何も気に留めないないないない。正解なんで一人になってもたくさんはずっと一人だったね。報われない愛の例えば明日消えちゃったって考えにわかんないさ。もう雨で声からしたって届かないない不愛愛なんて言い方もだって何も示せばずっと悪魔のそば夢から覚めてよ不正解ばっか引き出しちゃって考えきっと知る見てもああ何も涙しないしないないない正解だって感じる限界をなくさよ。いつかきっと痛みも消えて報われたよって
dark. Finally, I can see you crystal clear. Go ahead and sell me out, and I'll lay your ship bare. See, I'll leave with every piece of you. Don't underestimate the things that I will do. There's a fire starting in my heart, reaching a fever pitch, and it's bringing me out the dark. The scars of your love remind me of us. They keep me thinking that we almost had it all. The scars of your love, they leave me breathless. I can't help feeling we could have had it all. In the deep, you have my heart inside your hand, and you played it to the beat. Baby, I have no story to be told, but I've heard one on you, and I'm gonna make your head burn. Think of me in the depths of your despair. Make a home down there as mine sure won't be shared. The scars of your love remind me of us. They keep me thinking that we almost had it all. The scars of your love, they leave me breathless. I can't help feeling we could have had it all. In the deep, you have my heart inside your hand, and you played it to the beat. Could have had it all. In the deep, you have my heart inside your hand, but you played it with a beating. Throw your soul through every open door. Count your blessings to find what you look for. Turn my sorrow into treasured gold. You'll pay me back in kind and reap just what you sow. We could have had it all. We could have had it all. It all, it all, it all. We could have had it all. In the deep, you have my heart inside your hand, and you played it to the beat. Could have had it all. In the deep, you have my heart inside your hand, but you played it, you played it, you played it, you played it to the beat.
흐린 기억이 스쳐 지나가는 작아진 언덕 위에 올라 긴 새벽을 그저 바라보네. 소리 없이 낙엽만 쌓이네. 해가 떠오르면 새들도 찾지 않는 항상 한 가지만 남아. 푸른 추억들이 하나둘 잊혀가는데 하늘은 밝게 웃고 있어. 가지 말라 가지 말라 소리치던 너 그 눈물도 오랜 시간 속에 흩어져 가고 보고 싶다 보고 싶다 애원해봐도 넌 아직 보이지 않고 아련한 그리움만 남아있네. 슬픈 기억이 다시 찾아오면 저미는 이내 가슴 위에 내 눈물이 비 되어 내리네. 사무치는 아픔을 적시네. 겨울비 내리는 하늘을 바라보며 눈물을 감춰보지만 금세 눈이 되어 머리 위에 쌓여가고 아픔은 너를 찾고 있어. 가지 말라 가지 말라 소리치던 너. 네 눈물도 오랜 시간 속에 흩어져가고 보고 싶다 보고 싶다 애원해봐도 넌 아직 보이질 않고 아련한 그리움만 쌓이네. 슬픈 결말에 잠 못 이루던 흔한 옛 단편 소설 같은 이야기. 마지막 남은 한 장 소녀는 오질 않고 소녀는 언덕을 내려가네. 돌아와줘 돌아가는 길목 위에 네가 서 있네. 눈시울을 붉게 물들이며 미소 짓는 너. 울고 있는 네 얼굴을 품에 안으며 또 애써 감추는 눈물 조용히 흘러내리는 내 눈물. 하염없이 흘러내리는 눈물. 내린 어느 겨울날의 연가.
Like an astronaut that's scared of heights, with a heart that's beating at the speed of light. You've been waiting for this feeling all your life. Sometimes it's just hard to realize when you're stuck in a moment and your spark has been stolen. This is our time to own it, so own
悲しみの海に沈んだ私、目を開けるのもこのままどこまでも落ちてゆく、誰にも見つけられないのかな。どこへ向かい何をすれば、ふと差し込む一筋の光、手を伸ばせば届きそうだけど、波にさらわれて見失った。あれは一体何だったのかな。暖かくて眩しかったの、無意識のカウンターイルミネーション、嘘つきは誰。深海少女まだまだ沈む暗闇の彼方へ閉じこもる。深海少女だけど知りたい、心惹かれるあの人を見つけたらな。昼も夜もなかったこの場所なのに、眠れない夜は続く。自由の羽を大きく広げて泳ぐあなたは綺麗でした。そしてまた光が降り注ぐ。見とれていたら目があった。気づいてこっちを振り返るあなたに、嘘つきな私。深海少女わざわざ沈む暗闇の彼方に赤い方、深海少女裸の心を見せる勇気、黒い海がまた許さない。こんなに深い汚れてしまった笑顔を目くぐりばっていった。誰にも合わせる顔なんてないの、もうこうでおいてよ。声にならない気持ちが溢れて溶けた。次の瞬間君が突然姿を消した。心配性の彼女は焦る。闇が彼を隠し一人きり。限界少女その手を伸ばす。ほらね君も素敵な色を隠してた。深海少女腕を引かれる。歌う祝福のマリンスの深海少女もっと知りたい。心惹かれるあの人を見つけたから。この海の出て今飛び立つの。
I was left to my own devices. Many days fell away with nothing to show, and the walls kept tumbling down in the city that we love. Grey clouds roll over the hills, bringing darkness from above. But if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like nothing changed at all? And if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like you've been here before? How am I gonna be an optimist about this? How am I gonna be an optimist about this? We were caught up and lost in all of our voices, in your pose as the dust settles around us, and the walls kept tumbling down in the city that we love. Grey
over the hills, bringing darkness from above. But if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like nothing changed at all? And if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like you've been here before? How am I gonna be an optimist about this? How am I gonna be an optimist about this? Oh, where do we begin? The rubble of our sins. Oh, where do we begin? The rubble of our sins. And the walls came tumbling down in the city that we love. Grey clouds roll over the hills, bringing darkness from above. Close your eyes. Does it almost feel like nothing changed at all? And if you close your eye, does it almost feel like you've been here before? How am I gonna be an optimist about this? How am I gonna be an optimist about this if you close your eyes? Does it almost feel like nothing changed at all?
Your skin is warm like an oven. Your kiss is sugary sweet. Your fingers feel like cotton when you put your arms around me. I feel like I'm just missing something whenever you leave. We've got all the ingredients except you loving me. And respectfully, vanilla, you taste like buttercream. You're filling up my senses with empty calories. I feel like I'm just missing something whenever you leave. We've got all the ingredients except you needing me. So respectfully,
foot lettuce. Burger King foot lettuce. The last thing you'd want in your Burger King burger is someone's foot fungus, but as it turns out, that might be what you get. A 4chaner uploaded a photo anonymously to the site showcasing his feet in a plastic bin of lettuce.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
The Forgetful House. Written by James Colton. Performed by G. M. Danielson. I stared up at the looming edifice in the crisp winter afternoon. I found it hard to believe that this was my house now, that after all these years, I was returning as its master. The circumstances weren't at all what I'd wanted, but then again, what had I expected? There was no other way. My house, I muttered. How many times had I called it that as a child? Yet now, to actually utter the words felt wrong. They held a new meaning, a meaning that didn't seem at all right. There was a loud clatter as Mike slid open the door of the moving van. "Let's get started," he said. "Go ahead and start unloading," I replied to Mike and my two other friends, Eric and Ryan. "I'm going to go through and get all the doors open." I fished a heavy set of keys from my pocket, one for every room. I knew from my parents' in-house nurse that most of the doors inside were locked. It kept them from getting too lost, she said. The entryway smelled strongly of dust, and beneath that was a subtle odor that I recognized immediately. Every house has a peculiar scent, one you can detect on any of its residents, and that defines the family. This was my smell, my family's smell. It smelled like home. Leaving the front door open for my friends as they began carting in the furniture, I strode down the hallway, pausing at each door as I searched for the right key to open it. Once I was done with the first floor, I headed upstairs. There were 5 bedrooms up there, and a bathroom. Once more, I worked my way down, unlocking doors, until I came to the last room on the right, the master bedroom. I got as far as putting the key to the lock when I paused. This was where it had happened. I slowly withdrew my hand. There was no reason to go in there. No reason to disturb that room. Returning downstairs, I was met with a surprise. Several boxes were stacked in the hallway, and all 3 of my friends had shed their coats and were brushing large clumps of snow from their limbs. "That blizzard came out of nowhere," said Ryan. I glanced out the window. Indeed, I couldn't see across the street. The snow was falling so heavily. "The weatherman didn't call for a storm," I said. "Well, you know how reliable they are," answered Eric. "There's no point in working in that. So we figured we'd just crash here for a while and wait it out." So that's exactly what we did. We unpacked the few boxes that had made it inside and rearranged some of the already existing furniture. But the storm showed no signs of waning. "I guess that's what you get for moving so close to the Great Lakes," said Ryan as we stared out the windows. "I hope your microwave made it inside." It had, and so we prepared a quick dinner, which we ate in the living room. I stared at the roaring blaze in the fireplace. It got dark outside quickly, owing to the short days of winter and the raging blizzard, and before long, our little corner of the house was the only one still blessed with light. Everywhere else had fallen into hushed and dusty silence. We laughed heartily, letting the echoes of our mirth fill the chamber in defiance of winter's fury. What could the storm do to us in here? We had warmth and light, and our good humor ignited our spirits as it reverberated off the walls, bouncing from ceiling to floor, corner to corner, until the entire room seemed alive with cheerful idiots. It was more than a cozy chamber could contain. Our laughter spilled out into the empty corridors, where it struggled with the darkness, failed, and died miserably away, just like Mother. "Hey," bellowed Eric, the remnants of a joke still showing at the corners of his eyes. "What's come over you?" I recovered myself. "Sorry," I apologized. "Say, the other week..." The mood was restored as I launched into a comical tale invented on the spot. Our laughter resumed, and I followed it as it soared over my head and out the door to my back, out once more into those darkened hallways where nothing but shadows moved. I listened to it as it stirred the dust in its last feeble death throes, watched as the shapes, satisfied that their murderous work was done, retreated to their quiet posts. "Are you sure you're all right?" asked Ryan. "My imagination," I replied, shaking my head as I turned back to face my friends. "Perhaps I should get myself to bed." Eric spared a glance at the dusty grandfather clock that rested in the corner. "If that thing still worked," he said, "then I dare say we should all follow your lead." "It's worse than that, I'm afraid," said Mike, looking up from his watch. "I suggest we call it a night before we all start having hallucinations. Who knows what the midnight hour could do to our fragile minds?" Everyone chuckled at his remark, except me. Familiarity breeds fear. Paradoxical, I know. Perhaps you can't realize when things are wrong unless you are intimately aware of how things should be. As I walked the corridors on my way to bed, I was aware. I had, after all, grown up in this house. I knew all its nooks and crannies. I knew how shadows fell across the floor and climbed up the walls. I knew the lumpy mass hovering to my right was just my father's coat hanging on a doorknob, except that Father was dead, and there was no door. But why shouldn't there have been a door there? I pondered the question as I passed, refusing to give the lumpy shape a second glance. Yes, there should have been. Once everything was settled down, I'd have one installed. Who cared if it opened into nothing? At least then there'd be a reason for Father's coat to hang there, on a doorknob that did not exist. I reached my room, shut the door, and locked it, then wondered what should happen if I had to get out in the middle of the night. I reminded myself that it already was the middle of the night, and my other worry. What if something tried to get in, kept me from unlocking it? But what should want to get in? I tried not to think about it as I changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed. It was my house, except it wasn't. It was my parents' house. I settled down under the covers, sinking into the silence of my parents' house. Elsewhere, my friends were quickly falling asleep, unfamiliar, unaware. They couldn't possibly realize that the tree which they'd all admired for its aged charm earlier in the day was just a couple feet too far to the left, for it cast that particular shadow, the one that looked like a hand, upon the wall. "Best get moving quickly," announced Mike as we emerged from the house. "The radio says last night's storm was just the beginning. We're about to get walloped." I really couldn't have chosen a worse time to move, but there was nothing to be done about it now. We hastily cleared a path through the foot of snow and began carting boxes and furniture inside. We had a few moments of brilliant sunshine, sparkling off the whitewashed ground like diamonds, before the clouds rolled in again. The snowflakes began to tumble lazily from the sky, and when the lake effect began to fall in earnest, we closed up the van and called it a day. "We'll be at this all week if it keeps up," huffed Ryan, stomping his boots in the entryway. "I hope you're not in a hurry to get rid of us." I was in no hurry. In fact, I loathed the moment when I'd have to enter the house by myself, to sit and walk and sleep in its emptiness. No one to talk to or laugh with. I might have gone even so far as to say I was afraid. Not out loud, of course. We spent the rest of the afternoon shoving boxes into their proper rooms, sorting through my parents' old possessions to decide what to keep and what to throw out. I felt horribly guilty every time I placed an item in the garbage pile, convinced that it must have held some sentimental value. I wondered if Mother and Father would disapprove of my ruthless sorting. I wondered if they'd even recognize most of the heirlooms. Above the constant din of our work, the radio crackled, struggling for clear reception as the storm mucked up the signal. The weatherman prophesied a bleak forecast. At least another 2 feet of snow by tonight, as much as 3 come tomorrow morning. I wondered if my friends would ever be able to leave. They apparently shared similar sentiments. "Well," said Eric, stretching his sore arms, "I've about had enough for today. No rush, right? Since we're stuck here until spring." We all voiced our agreement with weak laughs, and fetching some microwave dinners from the kitchen, retired to the living room. The fire crackled merrily as we ate, and afterward we fell to talking, just as we had the previous night. The storm this time was fiercer, though, and its moans shook the house as we tried to find a way inside. The cheering effects of the warm fireplace and our full bellies were dampened beneath the ferocity of the blizzard. Our jokes were few and far between, and our conversation slid ever closer to dark subjects. At last Eric sighed. What a storm. Nights like this are really only good for one thing." He cast his gaze about the room, eyeing each of us in turn with a meaningful expression. "The telling of ghost stories." Maybe it was just the way he said it. Maybe the winter gale had finally found a chink in the house's armor. Maybe it was something else. We all shivered at his suggestion. Or was it just me? "Come now," he chided us with a sneer. "We're all men. Show some nerve. Or do you actually believe in ghosts?" Did I believe in ghosts? Whether I did or not was irrelevant. If they did exist, then the only ones I had to worry about in this house, in my house, were Mother and Father. Why should I be afraid of them? "Well then," Eric continued, "since you're all so spineless, I'll go first." He launched into his tale quietly, whispering so we had to lean forward in our chairs to listen. It turned out Eric was a masterful storyteller. As he expounded on the details of his fictional spectre, made all too real by the groaning of the wind, I realized I'd chosen the seat with its back to the door and the cold darkness behind. I was terribly aware of that empty space, that gasping space, and the air seemed to cringe behind me. Eric was reaching the climax of his story. His voice was more hushed than ever. Mike and Ryan were eating it up, but I could barely hear. I strained to make out the words, but the harder I tried, the more impossible it seemed. I felt cut off from my friends, pushed farther away into the lonely dark with each passing second, until I thought for sure they'd pass out of sight and hearing forever. "Better stop, Eric," Ryan said teasingly. "Our host looks like he's about to faint." The shadows relinquished their hold, retreating into their proper corners, and I was amongst my friends again. My parents died in this house, you know. My friends exchanged nervous glances. Yes, replied Mike. You told us at the funeral. It happened in the master bedroom. I went on as if I hadn't said anything. That's the room next to yours, Mike. Then I realized everyone was staring at me, confused, scared. I'm sorry, I'm not sure why I... Quite all right, assured Mike. But I may demand that we may trade rooms. You're probably just tired, said Eric. We all are. I'm sure with all this heavy lifting, and in such bad weather, too. We could all use some extra rest, Ryan agreed. Maybe we should turn in early tonight. So we did. My 3 friends followed me upstairs, 3 sets of footsteps echoing my own. The first disappeared as we passed Ryan's room. He said goodnight and was gone. The second vanished shortly after. Then the third. The fourth persisted, and I steadfastly ignored it. I was careful as I entered my bedroom and shut the door, not to turn, for in turning I might see, and in seeing I might lose my already tenuous grasp on reason. I changed quickly and dove between the blankets, not giving myself time to wonder if I'd made the bed that morning, or if the sheets had been mussed up like that all day. I lay there, far from restful, my eyes darting here and there, as I tried to keep them from resting on any one spot long enough to notice what was wrong. Deep down, I hoped one of my friends had noticed something. Maybe Mike, who slept next door to my parents' bedroom, was frightened enough by my outburst in the living room to seek companionship. The hope died within me. We were all grown men. Pride would never allow us such an admission of weakness. Indeed, that was what prevented me from venturing out in search of comfort. I was ashamed of myself. There I was, cowering like a child in my own house, my parents' house, I reminded myself. It had never been mine, not since I moved out to start college. No, I was a stranger now. I had no more right to call the place mine than Eric or Mike or Ryan. A stranger in my parents' house. I finally tried closing my eyes, and that helped. Blind, I couldn't notice the wayward shadows. I couldn't acknowledge the drifting shapes. I could only listen. Listening, I could only be aware of the howling wind, the groaning house, the knocking pipes. Then there was a high-pitched whine, a click. I opened my eyes, and by the sudden absence of my alarm clock's gentle glow, I knew the power was out. I crawled reluctantly out of bed. Without power, there was no heat. Without heat, we'd all be frozen to death by morning. I remembered that my father had a generator put in the basement when I was a child, so with a shiver I began the long trek through the house. Familiarity breeds fear. You can always tell when you pass by something that isn't there, or fail to pass by something that is. It's the emptiness you feel pulling at your shoulder, or the small of your back, the presence that pushes against you, begging to be acknowledged. In the darkness, unless you're familiar with your surroundings, you can't be aware of these things. If you know, then you can't ignore them. With my friends all accounted for, sleeping in their unfamiliar beds, the hallways were empty. I felt compelled down the expanse as a howling filled my ears. The sucking, hollow, rasping breath of my parents' house. Of course, it was just the wind and the heat, unsustained electricity, being drained out by the winter storm. Of course it was. About a quarter of the way down, resting on one of the steps was a dark, amorphous shape. It might have been just a shadow, but what could have cast it? I had to make a choice, and I decided that if I moved, I'd return to bed, pile on some extra blankets, and deal with the cold until morning. I waited. The shape didn't move. Just a shadow after all. Every step had one, and every step cast its own dark silhouette on the one below. Still, when I reached that step, I skipped over it. What I saw on the first floor, illuminated by the feeble brightness of the blowing snow, was desolate, foreign. It made me think of my parents and of their decayed minds right before the end. I hurried through, holding my breath lest I inhale some remnant of their disease that clung to the walls, oozed across the floor, or dripped from the ceiling. Some scrap of delirium manifested in the creeping forms that any other man, less familiar with the angles and physics of the house, would have dismissed as the trick of the light. I reached the basement door and marched down the steps, feeling those tiny gaps between the stair treads grasping at my heels. It was utterly black down there, and I had to rely on memory to find where the generator rested. After a few minutes of stumbling around blindly, I stubbed my toe against it. Kneeling down, I ran my fingers along its cool surface, fumbling as I tried to get the machine going. As the light flickered on, there was a fleeting impression at the edge of my vision, a fluttering of panicked energy. I turned my attention toward the source and beheld the dimly lit basement, cluttered with forgotten bundles and boxes. Some of the debris I recognized from my childhood. Others were unfamiliar. I tried to track down where the flurry of motion had hid itself. Was it behind that crate? Under that blanket? I realized I was being foolish. What would I do if I found what I was looking for? Break my neck as I scrambled up the uneven steps, screaming like a little girl? I turned my back on the basement and flipped the light switch off. I was better off not seeing. I thundered back upstairs, back through the shifting corridors, past the shapes I told myself weren't really there. My hand fumbled on the doorknob to my bedroom. Of course, I had shut the door, right? I must have, because it was closed. There was, I insisted, nothing else that could have shut it. Finally, I stumbled inside, none too gracefully as I tripped over a pile of clothes that I knew shouldn't have been there. "What are you doing?" asked Eric as he propped himself up sleepily. "Wrong room," I apologized, backing out slowly and shutting the door. Lost in my own house. I couldn't help but recall how all the doors had been locked when we first arrived to keep them from getting lost. Now it was happening to me. That's why I was noticing things. Nothing was different. Nothing was wrong at all. It was me. I counted the rooms carefully this time as I proceeded all the way down to the end of the hall, making sure I chose the door on the left, the one that stood open. Had I closed it? I couldn't remember anymore, and with a chilling sense of doom, I realized I was turning into them. I lay down in my bed, and I realized I was shaking. I tried to ignore the noises, the shadows, all the aberrations that my familiarity with the house allowed me to detect. They were not aberrations. I was the aberration, just like they had been to each other. I wondered if I'd recognize my friends when I woke up. The storm, blessedly, had stopped by the time the sun rose, and my 3 friends, whom I recognized with an overwhelming sense of relief, helped me finish unloading the moving van. "Looks like that's it," said Ryan as he slid the door shut. "Thanks for all your help, guys," I said. "Sorry things got dragged out like that." Mike shrugged off the apology. "Can't control the weather. At least the roads are clear." Snowplows had been buzzing back and forth while we worked, allaying our fears of being stranded. The electricity had been restored, and everything seemed cheerful in spite of my harrowing night. "Listen," said Eric. "Since we won't be seeing as much of each other anymore, what do you say to grabbing lunch somewhere and before we head out?" I agreed, and we piled into my car and drove down the street to a small diner where we talked and joked and laughed one last time together. It was unbelievably pleasant, getting out of my parents' house for once. It had been 3 days, but already I'd grown weary of the empty hallways and dusty chambers and that locked bedroom door on the 2nd floor. It would be that much more desolate once my friends were gone. I'd be alone, utterly unknown in that expansive house so full of shadows, and so terribly familiar. I began to wonder why I'd agreed to take the house. Why, after all my siblings had stated their lack of interest in the place, had I foolishly decided to move in? I was cutting myself off from my friends, trading their cheerful conversation for a constant reminder of my parents' pitiful end. It was my mother. You know how bad their Alzheimer's disease was, but it was my mother who started it. She didn't recognize my father got startled and knocked his head against the mirror. The strain was too much for them both, and they died like that, tearing at each other, each convinced in their own mind that they were fighting off an intruder. They never liked strangers coming into their house. I realized with some embarrassment that my friends were all staring at me from across the table, their burgers hovering awkwardly between their gaping mouths. Their eyes were full of concern and bewilderment. "No," said Eric. "I'm not sure you know how to have a good time." "You're looking kind of pale," Ryan chimed in. "Are you sure you're all right?" "Sorry," I sighed. "Just pretend I didn't say that. Memories, you know." They all nodded slowly, their eyes betraying a lack of understanding. We finished our lunch in relative silence before driving back to the house. We said our goodbyes, then my friends climbed into the moving van and left me alone. Alone, I turned back to my parents' house, and alone, I crossed the familiar threshold, shutting the front door quietly behind me and locking it. I gazed about me, studying the piles of boxes yet to be unpacked. One of them was half open, throwing a flimsy cardboard flap into the air to reveal its crowded contents. I stared sickly at it, in the knowledge that we hadn't opened any boxes that morning. They were all taped shut. I had taped them shut, right? I thought about going over and closing up that rebellious box. But then, whether by a draft or something else, the loose panel